Okay, I'm gonna go through Jefferson. I'm gonna try to get through this kind of quickly, and I am gonna cut out some of the context that I normally add when I teach this in class about Jefferson. But I think information on him is pretty available. There's some great books that have been written. John Meacham's book on Jefferson's really good. Very well known, obviously, as a founding father. I think some of his core ideas are still you see very much ingrained in the U.S. He's situated on Mount Rushmore. The example of the Louisiana Purchase I use with Jefferson is again just that he's a complicated figure and very much an ideological conservative, or at least kind of for our country's founding. That conservative ethos that limited government, the government that governs the best governs the least, that kind of idea is what something I think Jefferson really incorporated into his thoughts and his writing. With the Louisiana Purchase, you see a president who advocated limited government, but then uses the power of the government for this huge land grab that doubled, the size of the United States, and the Lewis and Clark expedition, and a number of other things. So just a complicated person. And I used in the last lecture the example Jefferson knew slavery was wrong as a child, or as a younger man, and then I think he knew it was wrong throughout his life, but especially as a young man was an outspoken critic. Not only did he have up to about 600 slaves at Monticello that worked on his plantation, but he also, this is really hard to sum up in just a few minutes, but with a young woman who was 15, a slave at Monticello, after his wife died. His wife had died. She had asked him not to remarry. And I even struggle with the words because it's hard, if I use a word like relationship, it's hard to say that that a slave owner and a slave girl had a relationship. It's not clear what it was exactly. I mean, you characterize it as rape. She was 15 when it began. She traveled to Paris with Jefferson. She would have been free there, but they remained together. And over a course of time, they had 7 children together who lived at Monticello. One of the hardest things for me to wrap my head around is how Jefferson had essentially children who were his own, who lived at his plantation, but that he didn't really embrace and fully recognize as his own. That's just always something that I struggle with. So they were freed when they turned 18, and it's some people see Sally as savvy in that way, that she was able to secure the freedom of her children and her own freedom. But again, there's so much that I think is hard to know and fully flesh out. I would highly recommend this picture is the family reunion for the Jeffersons, both from his first wife's side and then from the Sally Hemings affair. And so the Hemings descendants and the other Jefferson descendants, and they're holding their reunion together. And the video that I posted, which is a recent video within the last year, that shows 2 of the descendants from both sides coming together. It's a really great video, and I hope you'll watch it. I posted it on the Canvas site. I think it just explains kind of the context and some of the ongoing situation a little bit better. For a long time, there were rumors about an affair between Jefferson and a slave at his plantation, back even in his time, but they were denied and overlooked, and then DNA evidence in the 1990s confirmed it. Annette Gordon wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on it, so if you are interested for more information, that book would be one that I would recommend. All right, so we're gonna get into Jefferson more in depth. I do think it's important to mention the Sally Hemings issue when talking about Jefferson. One of the key things that I like to mention is stability. Just like Plato, a stable society was a key focus of Jefferson and his plan for education. It's why he advocated it. A lot of people today associate public education with the growth of industrialization, and there's truth to that, which we'll get into in the class. But I always like to connect uh, the sort of ideas and thoughts behind public education to democracy and the formation of our society, self-governing society. He designed the Jefferson designed the University of Virginia and founded that university. And I always like to point to, you can see in some of the original design, which he designed, did the architecture for the Greek columns. So he's very connected to Greek society. Um, and it should be obvious the connection to Plato when we look at his Jefferson's education plan. The Unite the Right controversy and uh, event that happened at the University of Virginia centered around Jefferson's statue at the university. And so that's been another issue that in class I've talked about in terms of contextualizing Jefferson. All right, the piece we read begins by notes on the state of Virginia, which is not well written. His prose was not very good. It's not very easy to read, but it is a short section, and I think even there's a significant paragraph there where you get a really good idea of his education plan. But in the context that he puts this, he's talking about laws for the society, how we're going to set up our society and our social order. So it's in that context that he's talking about the plan for education. He talks about religious freedom, laws for the land more generally. He even mentions emancipating slaves after a certain date. Obviously, that didn't come to pass. And is talking about concepts like freedom and happiness, which he incorporated in the Declaration of Independence. Um, so I want to point out, I'll get to the different sections or tiers of the education plan, but for the general setup, what he recommends or what he's advocating for are basically districts. What he called them hundreds, but just 5 to 6 square miles, which would contain, within that various properties would be taxed. They would pay funds toward the operation of a school. And I think what he envisioned was those districts governing the schools. And you can see that today. I'm blocking it with this lecture, but behind me is a map of Indiana with the way it's kind of cut up with districts. And that's very much embedded in the ethos of America, that schools are managed by local districts. So today we have way more federal policy and guidelines and standards and things that influence education than ever have existed in the past. More state involvement as well. But even today, school boards, local school districts still make school boards, which are made up of elected officials from the community, still make major decisions about hiring the school leadership, teachers, policy, adapting curriculum, policies that we'll talk about through the semester. So that still existed today, and I think there's a lot of great aspects to it, and some that are at times somewhat problematic or make different reforms or sometimes pragmatic decisions, sometimes challenging in certain ways. But that's still the setup. So going back to his tiers, then what he wants is at this level, the district level, he advocated for a tax-funded public education. And if you use the word all, you kind of have to put that in quotes, obviously, because there are slaves at this time period, people who are left out of his plans, but revolutionary in the sense of accepting kids from different classes or backgrounds and opening to women. So it would have been co-education, boys and girls receiving a basic education for a few years. And they would have been taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and then he advocated history, which is something I'll come back to. Each of these has a pragmatic reason for them. You learn math so you can conduct your business affairs. You learn to read so you can read the newspaper, so you can be informed about voting or go to the library. there was a pragmatic kind of, I think, aspect to his school plan. He the second tier, it basically is selecting the top. He puts it like boy genius, the top student who's male at each district school. In his context in Virginia, that would have been about 20 overall, to go on to a grammar school. These were boarding schools. They were selective. The kids would have stayed there. I used the pictures in the background again are Indiana Academy because that's a similar setup there. The They're paid for at public expense. It's a boarding school, and that's one of the top schools in the state and in the country, and considered a yeah, an advanced kind of education, and that's what Jefferson was advocating. William and Mary would have been kind of, he labels that as the third tier, but uh, it would have been basically just a college education. That was the college that he went to. That was the one available in Virginia. But basically to cultivate leaders for the new country is what he says. So the top students from the boarding school, a few of them would have been at taxpayer expense sent on to college for college education to become the new leaders of the country. And that should be obvious again with Plato's plan. The similarities with Jefferson are that he was trying to create social stability and then advocating for a system that was used to select leaders for the country. I like to point out the other thing that I think with Jefferson and Plato is that they have this element of elitism to them. They seem very skeptical of people in general. Um, I don't think they envision people really selecting the leaders or, you know, in a sense, I mean, Jefferson obviously advocated for democracy, but, through the education system, you're not giving that potential to a broad swath of people. You're sort of cultivating a number of people who could go on, a limited number, and then reducing it to males and things like that. But on the other side, I mean, he is suggesting that leaders come from different classes, different background, and Jefferson, who was born into the in aristocracy or had aristocratic roots, rejected that system and hoped to see kids from different backgrounds have that capacity to rise up on their own and to potentially be leaders. So similar in my mind to Plato in that sense as well. Um, I'm gonna finish up with two things here. One is I would draw your attention to the second page of the reading, or I'm sorry, it's on the last page, which I think kind of is like the third page of the reading, and there's a short section there on history, and I would recommend to you to read that over. Basically, what he's advocating for is that history be taught to prepare kids for the present time period to better understand. You could better understand your present time period if you understood what had happened in the past. And I think it speaks to that element of Jefferson that's advocating for social stability and the connection between education and society. That kids will eventually grow up and learn to be able to better understand and self govern if they have an understanding of their context and their time period. And one of the other activities that I do that I'm just going to touch on briefly here is when I talk about Jefferson, connecting him to free speech. There's a lot of really troubling views, I think, emerging today around free speech, or a lack of maybe commitment to free speech in the way that it's existed previously in this country, and something I think is really important. And what I like to do with students in classes, talk a little bit about freedom of speech in society more generally, where almost all forms of speech are protected, even if they're terrible or hate speech, offensive speech. You're not going to be locked up and thrown into jail for them. People can say and have said, obviously, some pretty horrible things. Those things are protected, and even though it is hard sometimes, I think in practice, it does generally, it is an important facet of our democracy and our system of government, the way that our government has operated over time. Protected speech includes symbolic speech. So even horrible things, things people might find horrible, like flag burning, still protected speech under the Supreme Court. Um, but in schools, the difference between protected and unprotected speech is vastly different. And I'll just give a couple quick cases. The one that people really look at, and the one that changed things the most in the 1960s, was the Tinker case. And these were two students, I think it was a brother and a sister, who wore black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War. They were suspended. They sued. The Supreme Court said the school had violated their rights. Students do enter school doors with some general freedom of speech rights if they're not causing a disruption or obstructing the operation of the school system. To draw a contemporary reference to this, recently there was the shooting at Parkland High School in Florida, and out of that there was a national walkout from school. Students walked out. It happened in Muncie at a number of different school districts in this area, and a number of the students wore black armbands, and they did that as a reference to the Tinker case, that symbolic political speech is protected under the First Amendment. Other cases that have happened, the Frazier case, I have this right. This one was a student gave a speech with offensive double entendres and was suspended, sued. But in that case, the court limited the student's right to free speech and said that offensive language can be limited by the school. In another case that's known as the Bong Hits for Jesus case, a kid unveiled a banner which read those words, Bong Hits for Jesus, at a passing of the Olympic torch. So it was outside of school, but it was like a school field trip. And the court said that the school does have a right to limit freedom of speech, even at school sanctioned or outside the walls of the physical walls of the school. That's opened up a number of issues today around social media, things students post. And again, it gets complicated. In some cases, you have bullying and problematic ways that students attack each other on social media that schools are trying to curtail and intervene in. And then other times where maybe students are just being mildly critical of the school, and the school steps in and disrupts their speech. So in practice it gets complicated, but I think it's helpful to know about this issue and to think about it. And it is a great paper topic if it's something that stands out to you and interests you. So, all right, I hope that helps with Jefferson and helps to better understand it.